We have a very important and interesting topic on the agenda. On the 28th of July, Venezuelans in the country and abroad were called upon to the new presidential elections. These elections were highly observed by most of the world due to the previous acts of government not allowing opposition to compete. Despite the serious mechanisms to guarantee safe and free elections, many international organizations and NGOs such as Carter Center, the UN, the European Union, and many countries have not fully recognized or have not recognized the electoral results due to electoral tampering. Both parties have been declared as having won the elections, and several announcements have been made from the government if the results are not respected. Under this scenario of uncertainty, we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? How did Venezuela get to this point? Is there still hope for democracy and justice in the country? In this case, we have invited Sonia Zapata, lawyer and founder of the Norwegian Venezuelan Justice Alliance, and Leif Marsteintradat, professor at the Department of Comparative Politics, to guide us through this delicate situation Venezuela is currently facing. So in that sense, I would like to ask the two of you if perhaps Leif, you could start with the first question. Could you provide more context on the political and human rights landscape of Venezuela? How did the country reach this point? It's a question for the two of you, but Leif, could you?
Yeah, thank you, Jose. Sonia. We were speaking before, so I'll deal more with the political side, and Sonia more on the human rights landscape, I guess. But let's see how things develop. How did they reach the point? This is a long story. I'll try and make it brief. But of course, we're talking about first of all, at least 25 years of a revolution, self-declared revolution. Chavismo, which got to power in 1999. And there's been a long period of conflict between opposition and the regime. I think things came to a turning point after Chavez's death in 2013, in particular with the parliamentary election in December of 2015, when the opposition for the first time managed to not only participate, but also win the parliamentary election in December that year. And they won also by gaining 2/3 of the majority in parliament, and this forced Chavismo, the regime, to show its face to the extent that they denied the opposition that victory by first of all stopping 3 representatives from taking position in parliament, but also denying them of the 2/3 majority, which was key at the time, because with such a majority you could actually gain full power of the country according to the constitution. So from that moment on, Chavismo, even though there have been many debates, the regime was no longer democratic, the way at least I would define it. And it's also a turning point because this is when the opposition starts using the Chavista constitution, the Bolivarian constitution of 1999, against the regime, whereas before it had been criticizing the constitution, and now we see things turn because the opposition starting using the constitutional tools, whereas the regime itself tried to flee away from the democratic element. So in 2016, the opposition tried a recall referendum to stop Maduro there and get him out of power. And the regime stopped that initiative then. And there's also been escalations since then. There was a presidential election in 2018 where the opposition didn't participate. They boycotted, accused the regime of fraud. There's been increasing levels of sanctions internationally, starting in 2017, but increasing later on. And in 2019, after the opposition had not recognized the presidential election, Juan Guaido, as some may remember, he was president of parliament, declared himself president, saying that the presidency was void, was empty, and that he had right to do that. So then the opposition started a strategy of maximum pressure, I would say, trying to force Maduro out through, let's say, constitutional tricks, so to speak, but also through large-scale protests. And this was responded by more repression. This is a period where repression is increasing, at least from 2015. After, let's say, the failure of the Guaido tactics of this maximum pressure, we've seen a period where there's been negotiations on and off, in part facilitated by Norway, but there's been many actors. And there have been negotiations earlier, maybe as early as 2002, I think the really first attempt start. But we see more intense negotiations. Many of them are short-lived. Most of them fail. But leading up to this election that were held now on July 28th, there was a partial agreement called the Barbados Agreement, signed towards the end of 2023, where the main issue was a promise from the regime to hold free and fair election, and promise from the opposition to participate in those. And of course, the elections were held now on July 28th. They were clearly not free and fair. We could see that in the build-up, where many parties could not participate. Candidates were banned. Most known of them is Maria Corina Machado, who was elected in the primaries of the opposition. And the opposition ended up running with Edmundo Gonzalez, who ran as presidential candidate. It was a campaign with widespread repression. There were very few Venezuelans abroad. I see some of them here, who were not able to vote. There are, I guess, around 7 million Venezuelans living abroad now. Very few of them could actually participate. Even though there were several attempts by the regime to have the opposition withdraw, getting them to state unfair condition, the opposition stayed in the game. And on election night, it became clear this was a landslide for the opposition. They looked to win about 2/3 of the vote. And the regime then stopped the count, basically. And later produced some figures giving Maduro a thin victory of about 52-53%. Whereas the opposition argued that it had won. And the difference in those two claims is that the opposition had copies of, it's about 80% of the actas, the paper sheets from the voting locales. 83%, thank you. Meaning that they could demonstrate that the figures that Gonzalez and the opposition presented were actually correct. And this has been later verified by several independent and international entities. The regime, then responded by having the Supreme Court make the formal decision. And the Supreme Court verified the regime's count, CNE's count, the Electoral Authority. And this is where we're at today, where we have a continuation or a status quo situation where Maduro and his regime is still in power. But clear indication of deep electoral fraud. And we see that the main opposition candidate, Gonzalez, he has fled into exile. He's in Spain at the moment. And we've seen increasing amount of repression during the protests that came early after July 28. So again, we have a continuation of deep scale repression in an authoritarian situation in Venezuela today. That was my
Thank you so much, Leif, for this
story.
For this political landscape. But then connected to this, Sonia, how would you say the human rights landscape is right now, or how has been deteriorating through the years under this regime?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. And thanks to Bergen Global for the invitation, Leif and Jose. Very good question to give context, really, because the battle for freedom and democracy in Venezuela has been so long and so complex that I think even Venezuelans, we get confused sometimes about what happened when. And we tend to lose sight of the fact that we lose sight of how did we get to where we are today. So this is a very good summary that you've done, Leif. I just would like to pinpoint two things in connection with the political part, because as you say, I mean, the link is unavoidable, right, between democracy and human rights. And I think there are two things that we should remember, you mentioned, and we should keep in mind, we are talking about a government that has been in power for 25 years. This is the same group of people and the same political party have been ruling the country for 25 years. And the second fact is that the regime that is in power now doesn't have any legitimacy and has never had any legitimacy. So, and then picking up a little bit on what Life was talking about, there were elections. This regime that is in power now is sitting in two periods based on two elections, the 2013 and the 2017 that you mentioned, Life. Neither of them have been ever recognized by anyone except typical allies of the regime that to be fair or democratic or transparent elections. So in 2013, it was electoral fraud, also flawed with all kind of irregularities, illegalities. Thanks to social media, we saw in the middle of the night the military setting fire to piles of boxes containing people's votes. Enrique Capriles, who was the opposition candidate at the time, called the fraud, denounced the fraud. People went out to protest. They were met with repression, and then Capriles called off the protest in order to avoid more violence and more loss of lives. And then we are back to the 2018 ones, 2017. Also, the whole world and about 60 countries in the world admitted that these had not been fair and democratic elections. Even Norway at the time, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was at the time Ine Eriksen Soreide, said publicly that Maduro lacked legitimacy. So the point I'm trying to make here is this is important because we tend to, and it often gets ignored. When Venezuelans went to vote now on 28 July this year, they didn't only go to vote for a new president. They went to oust and unseat a regime that has been encroached in power by force for over a decade. So I just wanted to plant that there very clearly, and these are facts. On the human rights, obviously, it goes by, hand by hand, loss of democracy and a repressive state that it just gets worse and worse. So the total dismantling of the rule of law, the loss of independence of the judicial power, the restriction of the civic space, all these are things that didn't happen overnight. The violations of human rights in Venezuela is something that our people have been enduring for decades, even during Chavez times. So if we look at the pillars of any justice system, they're all being co-opted, corrupted. And we can talk about the judicial power as such, the courts and the tribunals in the country, and we can talk about the prosecutor's office, and we can talk about the law enforcement agencies, all of them co-opted, and this is acknowledged, and there is abundant literature on each of them. When it comes to the judicial power, we can talk about loss of independence as far back as 2004. There is a report, very interesting one from Human Rights Watch, an international human rights organization, that says that the biggest blow to the rule of law in Venezuela was the takeover by Chavez loyalists of the Supreme Court of Justice back in 2004. So if you can check, we're not talking about 20 years ago, we already lost our tribunals and courts to the government interference. There is also a very interesting study for those of you that might be interested from Foro Penal. It's a local human rights organization in Venezuela, one of the oldest and largest that I'm very proud to be part of. And there is a study called the Repression Clock that shows how very early in Chavez time, he started designing the repression machine that later would enable him to stay in power, him and his successor that happened to be Maduro. So we see how far back this goes, and an emblematic case in terms of loss of independence of the judicial powers happened during Chavez time is known by anyone study this. Is called the Affioni effect, and the judge. This case marks a before and after in terms of independence of the judicial power in Venezuela. The Judge Maria Lourdes Affioni was a judge in Venezuela who was deciding a case at the time based on impartiality and application of the law, but had been given instructions to rule in a different direction. She defied the government and decided based on what she thought was fair. We don't have time for the particulars of the case. But the point is that she had to pay a very high price for that. Chavez himself called her bandit in national TV publicly and ordered her to be sentenced 30 years in prison for that. She had to serve in prison. She was tortured. She was raped. And this is an emblematic case because it is the first notorious interference of, the government in the courts and the tribunals' decisions. So you see how this is evolving very early, right? In terms of losing the rule of law was dismantled very early. And if you look at the prosecutors' offices, if we just look back at the two last chief prosecutors, Luis Ortega was the one sitting in the case against Afioni. So you can imagine how impartial and fair this prosecutor was. And the one that we have now that's been in charge for about 7 years or so, he still 1 week ago denying that there are any human rights violations in Venezuela against all evidence that can be, everywhere, or there is abundant evidence about all the crimes that are taking place. So I think in terms of context, just to wrap up, we see how this has happened, the dismantling of the rule of law, the absence of justice, and one other pillar that I was forgetting to mention is the law enforcement agencies. We talk about the police and the military in Venezuela are totally co-opted. That is also, everybody is very aware of that. In the case of the police, is just that any typical authoritarian regime creating agencies, intelligence agencies, CBINSA, CPC, FIS, you name it. And when it comes to the military, it's even more important because the military in Venezuela have become not only a repression tool of the regime, but the enablers and the key facilitators of the regime survival. So without an independent system of justice and without independent courts, there cannot be rule of law and there cannot be any respect for human rights. So I'll leave it there.
Yes, thank you very much, Sonia and Life, for both answers. This leads me to ask the following question. There are many reports on of the UN and other human rights observers have noted that and have reported that there are many human rights violations. But from the legal perspectives, what are these violations? What type of human rights violations can we name besides the most common and besides the most frequent that we can see on the TV outlets? And how to what extent can these victims achieve their right to reparation? Would there be a right to reparation for them, or would they just be another forgotten case in the future?
That is a very ambitious question. I don't know how much time I have, but I mean, only to talk about the violations and which violations we are discussing, it would take a long time, right? I mean, you could take a look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has 30 articles and with rights, fundamental basic human rights. You could say that in Venezuela, about 27 of those are violated on a daily basis. So I think I'll start because that takes too long. I'm gonna start with the last part of the question.
Yep.
About reparation, because that ties up with what we were discussing just now, right? That there is no possibility today with the current judicial power and the current system of justice in Venezuela. There is absolutely no hope for the victims in Venezuela to face justice or obtain any reparation in the current situation. So unless there is a political change and a total transformation of this justice system in Venezuela, that is not going to happen. And because that has been in place already, I mean, everybody's aware of this for a long time, that the only hope has been to achieve justice in the international level. And most efforts there have been focused on on what can be achieved at the level of the International Criminal Court of Justice in The Hague. So there are a number of states that are party to the Rome Statute, which is the foundational treaty of the court. It requested the court some years ago in 2018 to open an investigation for crimes against humanity committed by officials of the Maduro regime. And that is the case where most of the hopes are focused now. This has been a very slow process. In spite of starting in 2018, there was nothing really happening until 2021 when the prosecutor finally said that the first phase, which is called preliminary examination, was completed. But then the next phase is opening the investigation, and the regime has used all kind of tactical, legal, procedural tactics to delay the process time after time. They spend a lot of time and resources with the lawyers in order to prevent that process to go forward. But finally, last year, after all the appeals by the regime that were declared there was they didn't really stand in the law. So they finally decided, okay, let's go on with the investigation, and that's where we are now. So apart from that, international, it's like the principle of universal jurisdiction is another alternative that is being explored by some expert and human rights lawyers, which means that any country can actually prosecute crimes when the crimes are of such nature that they are not a crime that hurts a particular state, but we're talking about atrocities that are going against humankind, and therefore any country can actually prosecute the responsible of those crimes, even if it hasn't been committed in their territory or these are not their nationals who are being responsible. And in that sense, there is a case already open in Argentina, in the courts of Argentina, sponsored by the Clooney Foundation, and there are other candidates in the region that could be assuming a similar position, because there are other countries in Latin America that apply, or at least have in their regulations and legislation possibility to use the universal jurisdiction principle. So list of violations, do I have time?
Yeah, perhaps
It's very bad, you know, because
Yep. But
as I said, I mean, if we talk about repression, that's where the attention is normally on, right? Like there is this cycle, the repression clock, and then there is repression, and then that's where the attention comes from the media, obviously, because we're talking about violations of basic rights: the right to life, the right to your freedom, the right to safety, right to a fair trial, all these things. But I think it'd be a bit of waste of the opportunity to focus on that now, because you all can just Google now repression in Venezuela 2024 after elections, and you will see we have 2,000 plus detained political prisoners right now. This includes children, people with disabilities, the elderly. By the way, the children, some have been tortured. They have been charged with terrorism. Girls have been sexually abused. One of them I read just tried to commit suicide twice already, a 17-year-old girl. They are in prison now as we speak, and they're being tortured. So, I mean, you can check all these. There are hundreds of people dead, and not specifically now, that's been 25 on this one, but it was 160 in the last protest. So I think it's better for me to talk about something that normally gets ignored and lost in the air. That is the other lot of human rights and basic freedoms that are violated every day in Venezuela. And just to mention a few, because we don't have time, let's think about the right to food, something so simple. The right to health, the right to medical care. All these rights are violated in Venezuela. Venezuela right now is the country in terms of food with the highest level of undernourishment. So people are really basically not having enough to eat. When you talk about the health, the system of health, if they can be called a system, has totally collapsed. There are diseases like malaria that have disappeared and are coming back, just perfectly preventable diseases, just because there is no vaccination plans. I mean, there is so much to say about this. We don't have time. But obviously what I would like to highlight is that all this has originated the humanitarian crisis that we see today. And it's something that people don't know is Venezuela today is top of the list of countries that people are fleeing from. I saw just a couple of weeks ago, it was circulated by the Norwegian Refugee Council, the numbers and the figures. Venezuela is the country with 7.7 million people having left the country. Top in the list of the biggest forced immigration. Is above Afghanistan, is above Syria, is above Ukraine, which are countries at war. So this is important to understand. If you look at the right to education, for example, which is another basic human right, about 30%, according to some sources I checked, about 30% of our kids up to the age of 17 are missing school, are not going to school. And we can go on and on, look at the freedom of expression, free media. It is a lot more to say. It is bad in terms of freedom of expression and all that has happened to the media. There's not really like the classical independent media is gone. about 60 newspapers went out of circulation. Close to 300 radio stations have been closed, shut down. This gives you an idea. Union leaders have been detained for defending workers, right? Just in August, 6 union leaders were sentenced to 16 years in prison for defending workers, right? So I'll stop there.
So in this context, you have already mentioned quite some time that the judicial system and other systems and other political powers in Venezuela have been co-opted by government. But then, Life, could you perhaps mention something about the Venezuelan state capacity? I guess the conversation clearly hints that there is no clear separation of powers. But would there be any mechanism for the opposition to try and take back these check and balances? Is there any constitutional action they can take in order to get back at least something either in the judicial or in the legislature? Or
as Sonja's made quite clear, and you alluded to, Jose, today, for many years there's been no separation of powers, and the opposition did try to use the constitution, as I mentioned, through the 2015 election, aiming to use parliamentary powers to either gain control over legislation or force a constitutional change. They attempted with the recall referendum, but that door was closed, and of course parliamentary powers were stripped when in 2017 they elected this constitutional assembly in order to work as parliament. So there is really not any institutional venue that can be used at the moment for the opposition to create some sort of power balance. At least the way I see it now. The last attempt was, of course, the elections this year, and we saw that the regime did not want to accept the results. So the pattern here is, of course, that any challenge has been met with more repression, and of course, repression today is the key for the Maduro regime to stay in power, since they don't hold any democratic legitimacy any longer. So of course, when the regime is challenged, like the Manduro regime has been for the last, I guess, 9 years at least, there are two ways to respond to that. You could either try and open up and democratize, or we can increase repression. And in every instance, the regime has used repression, and the goal, of course, is to weaken and divide the opposition, silence the voices that exist in civil society among political parties. You see that many people, this is also, of course, due to the immense economic crisis of the country that's been ongoing for many years now. Many people choose to exit, to leave, right? And this also, of course, weakens the opposition and weakens democracy. So this the tool of repression has been used for years, and of course, migration, since this is becoming and has been for many years, of course, a hot political topic in neighboring countries and also in the United States. This is a political power the regime knows how to use, because they know there are elections from time to time in neighboring countries and in the US, and this may then be used as a leverage towards the international pressure that also exists. And of course, you mentioned state capacity. Of course, this state capacity in Venezuela is very weak. And it has been weakening over years alongside with the economic problems, and it does have consequences also for the type of repression we see and the actors involved in repression, right? Because it's not only the police and military forces that repress physically in Venezuela, to the extent that the state also goes into alliances with private or semi-private groups that you can see, when you have photos or videos from protests, you see it's not necessarily the military that goes in to stop these, but could also be organized gangs and so on that are in alliance with the regime. So you see that when the state's capacity has been reduced, it's also kind of contracted out part of the repression that it has used in order to weaken the opposition. So this also, the weakening state capacity also has consequences actually for the actors involved in these types of violation. And the reason the Maduro regime is still alive today is due to the repression. There's nothing else left to sustain the regime except for the fact that it's the regime that holds the weapons and holds that power.
Thank you so much, Leif and Sonia, for these answers, which leads me to open up a bit the floor on the international arena and the role that other countries have been playing or not playing in the current situation of Venezuela. Since we are in Norway, I would like to know what has Norway's position been in the ongoing situation, both at the human rights level, but also at the political level. Have they publicly announced that they don't recognize the regime? Have they been doing anything else besides announcements, or has there any help to or assistance to try to transition back to democracy? Perhaps, Sonia, you want to?
Yes, thank you. That's a really good question because it ties up perfectly with what Mike was saying, and he was referring to what is actually keeping Maduro in power and internally, and you're talking about repression, and that's the major tool towards the inside of the country, right? That's how you keep everyone down, through repression. But then there is the other aspect, and this has been what they have been playing with for years. Repress internally and try to figure out a dialogue to diffuse the international attention and heat, right? So that takes us to your question about what Norway has been doing. We know that Norway has been facilitating a dialogue since 2018 or 19, right? And that was one of the tools that they used after the last protest, and we're back to the repression clock. It's a clock, it's almost mathematical. Protests come because there is another hit on democracy and a further descent on authoritarianism, and the clock is in. Protests come, regimes represses, and finds someone that want to facilitate a dialogue, so the international attention is diffused. That's what has happened in Norway. Got in back perfectly in time after the last one, and after 30 more dialogues that have been along these years. Like was mentioning, probably the first dialogue was as early as 2002. There have been all kinds of sponsors and facilitators of Venezuelan dialogues, including the Vatican, UNASUR, the Boston Group. So when Norway came into the picture, we had already had lots of experiences with dialogues, and unfortunately unsuccessful dialogues, because what the regime has been doing is using dialogues as a tool to keep themselves in power. So from day one, it was clear, at least to many Venezuelans, that, I mean, we're very grateful to Norway for the good intentions, but it was very clear to us that it was, again, another, trick into buying themselves more time with the shelter of a dialogue and a credible facilitator. So to the extent that they can do that, to the extent that they can pull a goodwill facilitator that will buy them time, that will clear the international image, that's what they do. And that's how they get away, and they got away so far. So, I mean, I could say also on the, because you're talking specifically about Norway, but then getting back to Norway could do a number of things now. We don't know. You asked, what are they doing now? Honestly, nobody knows. We have been trying to have a dialogue with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have been in a dialogue with them from day one. Everything that I'm saying here, we have told them as the voice in our organization of many people in the Venezuelan community in Norway. And they have, everything I'm saying here, I've told them. And we don't know right now. I think, honestly, we think, and I think many Venezuelans would agree to that. At this point, after everything that Norway has invested in this dialogue, 5 years and a few million kroner, someone should sit down now and see, okay, what is the outcome of this? There are two things that we've been fighting for since the first negotiations and dialogues more than 15 years ago, which is liberate all our political prisoners, give us a chance for a free, fair, and democratic election. We haven't got that after any dialogue, including this last one. We got more political prisoners, more repression, and absolutely not fair and free elections, which is what we're discussing today. So I guess at some point, someone has to do an evaluation of what is happening and to what extent is it really convenient to continue with a dialogue that is not only not leading to the results that are positive for the Venezuelan people and for the oppressed, but are actually detrimental to our cause because are buying time and image to the regime.
Thank you, Sonia. Leif, would you like to say something, add up to this question?
Yeah, Norwegian attempt has been, of course, had followed up on several earlier attempts, and of course the intentions here are good. It's of course the main aim, I guess, is to make sure there is an opportunity for a political transition towards more democracy, and it's also a result of let's say every other attempt failing, be that through elections or been coup attempts and so on and so forth, and negotiations is a civilized and often the best way of managing a transition. And as Sonia mentioned, Norway has been leading these efforts since 2018, 2019. I guess Sonia knows more about what's been going on than I do, and even if she says we don't know much. But it has been a clearly a problematic attempt from the Norwegian side. First of all, everyone else has failed. It's really hard to believe that the regime is really interested in giving up power, because all evidence we have is that whenever it comes to the chance of actually yielding power to the opposition, they've blocked that path. But it's also problematic because negotiations is very controversial in Venezuela. I think on both sides, but of course the opposition doubts that the regime has really any sincere intent of negotiating their way out of power. And it also affects the situation on the ground. So even though Norway states that, well, we only participate if the parties want to, we're only there to facilitate, that kind of downplays their effect on the situation on the ground, because especially throughout 2019, 2020, the opposition was really split on whether or not to negotiate or try this maximum pressure. So only trying to attempt, even by trying to attempt negotiation, this effectively splits the opposition and then also affects the situation on the ground and the power relations on the ground. So that's one thing I think that UD, Foreign Ministry, has not been open enough about. The other issue is that I often see that Norway refers to this as peace negotiations, and honestly, they're not. That's a wrong conceptualization of things. It is about managing a transition to democracy, which is something else than ending a war. So I again, I don't know what they're talking about when they have these negotiations, but conceptually they go into it the wrong way in my mind. And I think that negotiating a transition to democracy with a regime that's not willing to yield power peacefully is, if anything, more difficult than negotiating peace. And of course, the issue now is that they managed a partial agreement, the Barbados agreement, that led to these elections, right? So the elections were the test. Finally, many people were extremely enthusiastic about this, and we saw that this in Venezuela as well, and among Venezuelans abroad. The enthusiasm for these 28th of July elections were tremendous, and they needed to be, because if not, people wouldn't have shown up to actually vote. And a subsecretary of Foreign Affairs said in a newspaper a couple of days before the election that these elections were the ultimate tests of our negotiation attempts. And yeah, if anything, they failed tremendously. So the negotiations here were, of course, the end result was supposed to be free and fair elections. And when I now read the response from the foreign minister that they still support further negotiations, I sincerely doubt. I question why Norway is doing it, because there should be some sort of point where facilitated reach a conclusion whether or not it's worth it and whether or not they do more damage than good. And the whole point was with these negotiations was to let the people decide. You leave it to the people to decide, who do you want in power? Do you want Maduro? Or do you want Edmundo González? They said in 2/3 majority, we wanted the opposition to lead. If you then go back to negotiation in order to make sure you have some sort of peaceful coexistence, you are in effect going against the voice of the people that you say you want negotiations to respect. So it's really hard to see, even though I do believe Norway is still attempting, but we don't know. But I do think we're still attempting to negotiate. If those negotiations aren't based around how to make an exit option for Maduro, I believe they are dead on the ground, and maybe should not be attempted at all. Because now, if we want negotiation, it should be about the conditions under which the regime will leave power, not on how one could share power after 2/3 of the population, of the voting population, have said they wanted change. But if there are negotiations, we don't know, and what the conditions are for these negotiations, we don't know either. But clearly by now, also Norwegian negotiations did fail, and I think there are reasons to at least criticize Norwegians' naivety during these years, because they've insisted that they have no power, no effect on things on the ground in Venezuela, but I think that their efforts to negotiate clearly also affect the situation on the ground. So Norway has been an actor and not only a passive facilitator.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, as it happens a lot in these events, we are running out of time. So perhaps just in a very few words, any final remarks either you or the two of you would like to say before we transition to the questions from the public? We have we have a little microphone, so people can ask questions.
I would love to be able to.
Yeah, in a very few words.
Very, very quickly. I mean, back to what can the international community do for us? There is a lot more than the international community can do for us now. And in fact, our lifeline and our return to democracy pretty much depends on what happens outside and what kind of support Venezuelan people can get from the other countries. Because inside, we've tried everything. We have protests. We have lost a lot of people in massive protests throughout the years. We have voted. We have abstained. We have gone to all kinds of dialogues. And as we were discussing, the country is shrinking. The social fabric is being hurt to the bone. So, I mean, there's no way a population that is not having sufficient food and that is totally repressed is able to pull anything to take out and oust this tyrannical regime. The life and the democracy of Venezuela depends on the support of the international community, and there is a number of things that many countries can do. At political level, to start with, there is the evidence available for anyone to check that the opposition, let's call it, we think they are the opposition now because we won the elections, anyone can check that. Any independent auditor can check the results and talk about the genuine and legitimate character of this documentation that has been put forward. Once this is admitted, the countries should, for once, have the courage to come forward and say, yes, they have proven to have won the elections and therefore recognize Edmundo González as the president. And politically, I mean, it is ridiculous what the countries are doing right now is that demanding that Maduro presents the evidence. There have been 3 months since the election. According to the law in Venezuela, that should have happened the same day when they announced the victory, or 30 days after that they should have published this in the official gazette. No, not that has happened. So at this point, asking the author of the fraud to prove that they won is not going to happen. It's unacceptable, and it is a bit of an offense to Venezuelan people that they're still asking for that evidence from Maduro. He's never going to show that evidence that he won because he didn't. So that's that political and diplomatically, there has to be a lot more pressure. We have seen a good job being done at the Organization of American States, where all countries finally got together in the Americas region in support of the Venezuelan people very clearly. And it took a lot of negotiations, but it happened. And that is sent a very strong message to other regions outside the Americas. We saw how BRICS, Lula recently, a week ago or so, vetoed the entrance of Venezuela in the BRICS bloc, which is something totally unexpected for many Venezuelans. This has been, Brazil and Colombia have been typical allies of the Venezuelan regime, so that took some of us by surprise, but it was a good way of continuing to put pressure and isolate. And legally, there is a number of instruments that can be applied to put pressure legally, because this is a regime that has all his profits outside Venezuela and all their assets outside Venezuela. And the top military regime that sustains this regime, all of them have multimillionaire assets and wealth all over the world. If these countries where this wealth is located apply their anti-money laundering laws, if these countries that are importing gold that is conflict mineral and that has been exploited by having modern slavery, kids working in, which is happening in Venezuela in the southern part of the country, if there is proper rules on that and there is supply due diligence regulations that are applied correctly, these people cannot continue doing this. So legally, there is a lot of, there are corruption-wide transparency. Venezuela have discovered there are only just the ones that they have found 167 cases of corruptions around the world in 29 countries. With the value of the ones, they estimated the value, only half of those is around $60 billion. When the Transparency Venezuelan persons discuss this with other Transparency International satellite offices, they don't understand that these figures can be so high. And we're talking about half of the estimated value of half of the cases, only the ones they have discovered. So there is a lot to do on that area too.
It's yeah, as you say, there's many things to do.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can introduce some questions from the public. Anyone who wants? Oh, there's a microphone. Perhaps if we can keep the questions short and direct, because we only have 10 minutes left, and I see there is also 2 questions in the front.
Yeah, there's something obviously missing from this presentation, and that is the reality of a nearly 3 decades long violent regime shift project from the USA and the most undemocratic portion of the Venezuelan opposition. I'd like you to take a look at this. This is from the web page of the Norwegian Venezuelan Justice Alliance. To Sylvia here. Yeah.
Do you have a
But
question?
you can
Sorry,
ponder
do
on
you
the
have a question?
manipulative propagandistic deceit this represents. It reads 70 barn fängslet och torturat i Venezuela with the hashtag Maduro secuestro niños, and a huge picture of a teddy bear in chains. Yeah.
And your point is?
The point is, what it omits to tell you, and what our esteemed speakers refuse to inform us of, is that these innocent children were members of violent youth gangs paid by the opposition to participate in violent riots. I witnessed this myself the day after the elections in Venezuela in Las Mercedes. I have photographs of it on my Flickr account, which you can go in and check out. Okay?
And the
Can
question
can-
is,
can I can I
The
just
question was
can I
because-
just say something as a
And it-
moderator of
Yeah.
the event?
Over 20 people were killed in these riots. Nearly 200 were injured, of which 74% were officers of state security agencies. More than 253 police stations were attacked. The innocent children set fire to institutions, hospitals,
Can I just say
schools, and
something
food
before we continue?
distribution
If
centers.
there is no gonna be a question, can we just transition to another person because we're lack of time?
This is telling you something which these people completely
If not,
ignore, because it is a very dishonest representation of what is going on. Okay?
Yeah, but then I would like
And
to have a
this
question.
is giving you,
Time for
they
this.
talk about the problems that Venezuela is undergoing, and
Are
yet
you, excuse
they
me, are
have
you
not
denying that
mentioned the
children are
most
being
extreme
tortured?
sanctions
Are you
ever
denying that the
placed
children
upon
are
a
being tortured?
country
Do
in
you have a
living
question?
memory,
We are not going to
which
accept
have
your propaganda
destroyed the
here.
Venezuelan
Look,
economy.
you are very lucky that this is democracy and
is
you can do what you're
Dishonest
doing. But
propaganda.
what you are defending is a regime that doesn't allow people
I'm
like
not
you to do what
defending
you're doing.
anybody. I'm giving you some
Yeah.
fact-based
You have a question.
examples of what is not in your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much. There was a question in the back. If we can just skip this brief, there's still a few minutes. We can answer some questions.
What are your general ideas on the exit strategy that could be done for the regime in the case of an agreement being made for them to go out?
should we take more questions and
Yeah,
then?
perhaps we collect more questions and then we can
Yeah,
just
see what's in.
do, there was a question here in the front.
Yes, there has been this story that there is, because of the enormous economic crisis and because of the bad governance of the regime, it has had the effect that they have sold out large tracts of the land, or allowed for large-scale exploitation of the country's mineral resources and natural resources, and that this has led to somewhat of a ecological crisis throughout the countries. Is that true? Or in that case, could you moderate that picture or give more details about it?
You mean that the situation down in southern area of the Orinoco, the Arco
Anyway.
Minero del Orinoco, that is absolutely true. It's a disaster. We don't have enough time, but I would encourage anyone to read. There is a lot of literature on this. You can find, but you could check one report by the OECD called Illicit Gold Flows from Venezuela. That gives you a very accurate picture of what is happening today in that area. Is if you just disregard the ecological damage, which is huge, and you focus on the human rights violation and the indigenous rights violations and the environmental rights violation, we can stay another 2 hours.
Can we just collect the last question before we
Sure.
answer? everything?
Yeah, I was wondering if who's Maduro's friends internationally, and also I guess this is far from an ideal situation, but what is stopping an international intervention from the UN or something like that?
Yeah.
Do you have a last question?
I had, maybe there's no time for answering it, but I had some questions about the effect of sanctions from abroad, because it's usually used as an argument of the situation, both when it comes to the election, whether the election should have happened or not, but also about the humanitarian effect of these sanctions. If you could say something like that.
Yes, thank you. So perhaps we can divide
Yeah,
questions and
I can start with the exit strategy question and touch upon the others. I guess Aslak got response from Sonia. Well, there are two sides to the exit strategies, and of course, the one is the legal side and the other is the political side, and they don't match really well, because Sonia mentioned there is cases now in The Hague and so on and so forth. Several people on the regime are wanted for several illegal action, be that drug trade, corruption, and so on and so forth. But of course, an exit strategy, if you look at it politically, you need to look away from justice, basically. It's really hard to think of someone willing to yield power knowing that they go straight to jail. So herein lies the huge dilemma, because you have so many Venezuelans and others who demand justice. And maybe the only way to get a change that is also demanded is to take a blind eye to the justice side of things. So what we see when there's been negotiated exit strategies are some sorts of power sharing agreements which secures the regime or the power holders from persecution. Exile has been used where people could go to friendly countries internationally and so on and so forth. But of course, any political exit strategy goes totally against the demands for justice for so many people. But it's really hard also these days, because it's if you have these agreements on a negotiated transition, they're not easy to uphold, because the fangs of international law are quite good these days, and there's really few places to hide. So even if in Venezuela one locally could give an agreement to the military leaders, the Maduro regime, it's not necessarily respected by The Hague, for instance, right? So this also complicates this. So I'm sure that these things have been discussed, but these are really, really difficult questions, because there are so many people who demand justice, and rightly so, right? But they know that if one wants exit strategies, they may go against that demand. And then, of course, international friends. Locally or in the region, Cuba, of course, Nicaragua, Honduras to a certain extent, but Cuba is, of course, the most important international friend in that region. But you also have Russia, China, Iran, and some of these are quite powerful actors, and this makes any international intervention unlikely. And Venezuela is a big country with many people under arms, and this is not something that is, I think, a realistic strategy, where you've seen international interventions in, let's say, Haiti, for instance, it's now 35 years maybe ago, but also in the 2000s. Venezuela isn't Haiti. It's not likely to happen. And these friends, even though they are authoritarian friends, and they are few, these are important friends for the Venezuelan regime, which dampens any effect of the more democratically international environment strategies towards Venezuela. But it should be said, and Brazil was mentioned here, Venezuela has lost many friends in the region this year. With these elections, Maduro went a step too far for former friends such as Brazil and Lula. Even Colombia, under current president, has started to withdraw support. So they're losing friends regionally, and this will be noticed and may have an effect in the time to come. And Hector's question on sanctions. Well, sanctions are do not have any positive effect in terms of creating a transition, which has been the aim, right? Or you can use them as leverage for negotiations, whereupon you can withdraw arrest orders in a transaction for an exit. Of course, they do affect the economic situation of Venezuela. The crisis started way before, so it kind of the negative economic effect for the Venezuelan population is something that has fortified the crisis clearly. Of course, there had been lifted some of them before these elections, but there's no reason to believe that the sanctions in and of themselves would have had such a tremendous effect on the electoral results. You see already in 2015 that the opposition had a majority. They would have clearly won any recall referendum in 2016, which is before any sanctions were put in place. So yeah, it clearly they clearly affect the Venezuelan economy negatively, but there's no reason to believe that they would have had any electoral effect of that magnitude. So that's That's what I think on these issues.
We only have a couple minutes left, so can we just?
Yeah, I will just confirm and a little bit elaborate on the sanctions. It's an interesting topic because I agree 100% and it is already proven, but there are many research studies explaining and building the link between the humanitarian crisis and the sanctions. And it is obvious that the humanitarian crisis is due to the corruption and mismanagement of our resources and not due to the sanctions, because the humanitarian crisis was already there when the sanctions were introduced. The financial sanctions were introduced in 2017, and the economic sanctions in Venezuela were introduced in 2018, where the humanitarian crisis was way before that. That's on one hand. On the second, the issue of sanction is a delicate one, because what we have seen is that it's normally used, whether you agree with it or not. The fact is that they're used for propaganda purposes and to take away the accountability for where it belongs, which is the regime. The country is sinking into misery because of the regime, not because of some sanctions. And to wrap that up, on the most recent sanctions, they are actually a little bit of a joke, because on one hand, they have said that they raised sanctions, but on the other one, the licenses that they have been giving to the big oil companies, because we have to remember sanctions in Venezuela is oil. That's the only export. That's where the money comes from. So you're talking about oil. Well, the licenses that have been given most recently to Chevron, to Repsol in Spain, to the number of oil giants around the world, means that the Ministry of Oil himself some months ago said we have record high production of oil and we are doing great. We can see a lot of growth and a lot of improvement they are producing, which is really, really good in terms of production, almost back to 1 million barrels of oil per day, which hasn't been seen in a long time. So they are doing a lot of good business. The question is, where is that money going? Because it's not going to the people in Venezuela who need it.
Thank you very much, Life and Sonia. Thank you, everyone, looking through Facebook and YouTube, and for the people who are present today, and of course to Bergen Global for the space. It was a very
Thank you.
nourishing and nice conversation.
Thank
Just
you.
to be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.